Have you ever wondered what happens to messages that repeatedly fail to process in your application queues? Do they get lost? Not if you're using a dead letter queue, also referred to as a DLQ. In this video, let's explore what a dead letter queue is, why it's important, and the benefits of using one. To explore and demonstrate a dead letter queue, I will be using Amazon SQS, but the core concepts apply to other queuing technologies as well. Hello everyone. My name is Rahul and welcome back to this YouTube channel. If you're new here, I make videos on .NET, Cloud, and DevOps. This video is sponsored by AWS and is part of my messaging series. To understand the importance of a dead letter queue, let's first see what happens when you don't have a dead letter queue set up. Here, in JetBrains Rider, I have a simple ASP.NET API application that sends messages to an Amazon SQS queue. Here I have configured it to send to the queue URL and this will send the messages. I also have a message handler that listens for messages on this queue and processes them as soon as the messages arrive. Now in the processing, all I'm doing is retrieving the message and writing this to the console. So you can see there is an event handler which simply reads the message and writes the contents in here. Now if the message contains the word exception, it throws an exception. This is simply to simulate an exception or a failed message processing. Let's run this and see this in action. Now this application also logs to Seek so that I can see the application logs inside here. Right now this is not running, which is why we don't have any log. Now as soon as it starts running, it will start sending logs and we can see it here. So let's update this time to be from now and keep running this again. Now if I switch back to the Swagger UI, go to the post message and send a message. So let's click execute. This is going to send the message to SQS, which will be processed by a message handler. So if I switch back to the events, we can see the successfully processed message, which is processed weather forecast added event. Now if I send more messages, those are getting executed in the background as soon as they're coming to the queue and those will be picked up and processed. Now in case where we have an exception, so let's simulate that by updating this text to be exception and click execute. Now in this case, the message handler fails and it starts throwing an exception. By default, what happens with Amazon SQS is these messages gets put back into the queue because they were not successfully processed. Now anytime we throw an exception inside the message handler like this is going to release the message from the queue and put it back into the queue. Now, if you're completely new to Amazon SQS, I highly recommend checking out my video linked here or in the descriptions below. Now, this message is continuously going to be in a loop until the message expiration time. Now, in my case, I have set up a queue and in the edit, we have the details for the message retention period, which is by default to be 4 days. So that message is going to be in this queue for 4 days trying to be processed. Now, the reason why we have retries in queues is to get over transient errors. So these are errors that's temporary in nature and will succeed in a few retries. However, in this case, our message handler is hard-coded to look for the word exception and keep throwing an exception. This might be a null reference exception or a business scenario that is missed to be handled and which will continuously throw an exception. Now in these cases, there's no point in retrying these messages in a loop forever, especially for 4 days. Now, you can update this retention period to be into hours or different days, but that doesn't solve the problem. You're still having the messages unnecessarily being in the queue and getting processed in the background. Let's go through some of the issues without having a dead letter queue. The main issue is that there can be a processing bottleneck. Now, if you have more failed messages in your queue, the new messages that gets delivered to the queue will be picked up at a slower pace because your message handlers are already processing these errored messages. This also tends to have inefficient resource usage because we are unnecessarily processing these messages in our message handlers, which is running code on our machine and our servers. We also have an increased manual effort if we need to go and clean these queues and remove these messages from the queue. Now, depending on the queuing technology and the settings, the messages can be deleted forever. Now in the queue processing, the message is still getting processed. So if I filter back to the time to now, you can see that the message handler is still failing and processing these messages. Now if we have more of these failed messages, the queue is going to get filled up with these messages, and anytime we send a normal message, that is also going to take time to process. So if I send a normal message after a few exception messages, you can see that it takes some time before it picks that up for processing. As you have more failed messages in the queue, this issue is only going to increase. A dead letter queue or a DLQ is a special queue that's used to handle messages that cannot be successfully processed or delivered to their intended destination. Messages are sent to the dead letter queue after exceeding a retry threshold, encountering errors, allowing you to isolate and inspect these problematic error messages. This also makes debugging, and it reduces the manual effort that is required to clean up the messages. Now, if we switch back to the queue, let's navigate to the weather service and go to send and receive messages. We can poll for messages inside here, look for the messages that are erroring inside this queue. So if I navigate further into this message, I can see that this contains the word exception, and because of which this is throwing the error. So I can find out the reasons from here and manually purge them out from this queue. So if I was to select these multiple messages and click delete, that will get removed from the queue. However, that is an extra manual process, and if you have more messages failed inside this queue, this soon becomes a problem. Now you can also have the option of purging the entire queue content, but then you also risk the loss of new messages that are coming while you're clicking the purge button. So because of these issues, the best thing is to have a dead letter queue attached to this queue. So anytime the message errors and crosses the threshold of the error count, it will be automatically moved to the dead letter queue. So we can do all our investigations on the dead letter queue and not on the main queue. Now to set up the dead letter queue in Amazon SQS, all I need to do is click edit and go to the dead letter queue section and assign a queue for this. So if I navigate to dead letter queue, let's make it enabled, and also let's specify a queue. So in this case, I'm going to specify the weather service DLQ, which stands for dead letter queue. Now I can also specify the configuration which says maximum receives, which looks at the maximum number of receives that this message can have on the main queue before it's moved to the dead letter queue. So let's keep this to be 2, which means after 2 retries, it will be moved to the dead letter queue. And let's click save. Now, if I navigate back to send and receive messages, once we have the message retry count for 2, these messages will automatically get moved to dead letter queue. So now there are still a few more messages in here. So if I stop the polling and poll again, these messages will soon be moved out of this queue to the dead letter queue. So if I navigate into queues and navigate to the dead letter queue, under that, you can go to start and receive messages and poll for messages, and we have those messages in there already. So I can easily navigate into this queue, navigate for the messages and clean them manually. Now, if you have a lot of messages coming to your dead letter queue, it's best to fix the code problem or the business process so that you can avoid the extra step of monitoring this dead letter queue. Now, once I know that all these messages are because of exceptions, I can select these and also delete them from here. So let's delete all these messages, which means the dead letter queue is now empty. So in your application monitoring process, you'll have to make sure that you regularly check the dead letter queue for failed messages and do the necessary actions to clean them up or fix the actual code problems or business scenarios. However, this reduces the manual effort that you need to do on your primary queue and also makes it easy to identify the errors that's happening inside the queues. These messages also doesn't block up the main queue and is easily moved to the primary queue. SQS also supports sending back these messages from the dead letter queue to the original queue so that if you are fixing something, you can reprocess these messages. Now, if you want to learn more about redrive in SQS, let me know in the comments below and I'll do a separate video on that. If you like this video, please make sure to hit the like button. If you want to be notified of future such videos, please hit the subscribe button. It also helps me to grow this YouTube channel. Thank you and see you soon in the next video.